And the night had been planned for weeks. Inside the sprawling estate of Donovan Sterling, the man newspapers often called the ruthless king of real estate, the atmosphere was nothing short of royal. His mansion, a sprawling monument of glass, marble and steel, was perched on the city's highest hill, overlooking the glittering skyline like a throne above the people. Everything about it screamed wealth. The fountains outside danced with crystal-clear water, lights shimmered across manicured lawns, and the long driveway was lined with luxury cars that looked more like museum pieces than vehicles. Inside, the air buzzed with activity. The long dining hall, where tonight's dinner would take place, was prepared like a stage before an audience. A massive oak table stretched the length of the room, polished until it gleamed like a mirror. Golden candlesticks flickered against the towering chandelier above, sending shards of light scattering across the walls. Every plate was bone china, every glass crystal, every fork and knife silver. It was the kind of room designed to impress, to remind anyone who sat there of one thing. Donovan Sterling was a man of power, wealth, and control. But behind the glittering surface, another story was unfolding in the kitchen. Clara, the maid, worked tirelessly as the clock ticked toward the dinner hour. She wasn't just any maid. She had been with the Sterling family for nearly 12 years. A black woman with a quiet strength and eyes that carried both kindness and weariness, Clara had dedicated much of her life to serving this household. Though she rarely received praise, she continued her duties faithfully, knowing that her livelihood, and that of her family back home, depended on this job. Her hands moved quickly yet carefully as she checked the roasted chicken, basting it with butter and herbs that released a rich aroma. She stirred the pot of seasoned rice, fluffing it with a wooden spoon the way her grandmother once taught her. There was fresh bread in the oven, vegetables seasoned with garlic and lemon, and a small peach cobbler cooling by the window. Every dish was more than food to Clara. It was a memory, a story. The recipes had been passed down through generations. She remembered standing in her grandmother's kitchen as a child, watching her cook with the same movements, the same patience. To Clara, cooking wasn't just work. It was love, a way of keeping family traditions alive. But tonight, her heart raced faster than usual. She knew Donovan Sterling well. He wasn't a man easily pleased, especially when it came to meals. Despite years of service, Clara often felt invisible to him, nothing more than background to his glamorous life. Worse, he had a sharp tongue and no hesitation in using it. He demanded perfection, and even then, perfection was never enough. Still, Clara hoped. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. The kitchen door swung open as one of the butlers entered. "Clara, it's time," he said curtly. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the same weight as every servant in this house bore, the need to be precise, to move quickly, to avoid mistakes. Clara nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. She adjusted her headscarf, straightened her back, and began carrying the trays toward the dining hall. Each step echoed in her ears as she walked the long corridor. The smell of her food followed her, mingling with the faint scent of cologne and wine drifting from the dining room ahead. She entered. The chatter of the guests filled her ears. Donovan sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding the room. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, he radiated authority. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room like a man always measuring, always judging. Around him sat a few close associates, men and women in designer clothes, and beside him, his pride and joy, his daughter, Isabel. At 17, she was beautiful in the way that drew admiration wherever she went. Unlike her father, her features carried warmth, with soft brown eyes and a smile that could brighten even the coldest room. She was quiet now, listening politely to the adults, but her gaze flickered curiously when Clara entered with the food. Clara set the first dishes on the table, golden roasted chicken glistening under the chandelier, bowls of rice seasoned with herbs, platters of vegetables so colorful they looked painted. She placed the bread basket at the center and finally set down the peach cobbler, its sugary crust catching the candlelight. The guests murmured their approval at the sight, their stomachs awakened by the aroma. Some leaned forward eagerly, eyeing the dishes with genuine interest. But Donovan Sterling leaned back, swirling his wineglass slowly, a faint frown forming on his lips. He tapped his finger on the table, a sign Clara had come to dread. "Ladies and gentlemen," Donovan said smoothly, "tonight we have a meal prepared by Clara. She has been with us for many years, so I trust she's tried her best." The words sounded polite, but the tone carried something colder, something dismissive. Clara's chest tightened. She kept her head lowered, standing by the wall as was expected, her hands clasped together. The plates were passed around. Forks and knives clinked softly. The guests smiled, nodding at one another as they took their first bites. But all Clara could see was Donovan Sterling's face as he cut into the chicken, raised a piece to his mouth, and chewed slowly. For a brief second, there was silence. And then, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. His sharp eyes flicked toward Clara, and she knew. The judgment was coming. The first bite lingered in Donovan Sterling's mouth longer than expected. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as though testing every grain of rice, every strand of seasoning that Clara had worked so hard to prepare. His eyes narrowed, his jaw shifted, and the silence stretched unbearably long across the polished table. Clara stood near the far wall, her posture straight, but her heart pounding in her chest. She had been through this before, this moment when Mr. Sterling would either nod approvingly, say nothing at all, or worse, unleash his cutting words. She prayed quietly in her heart that tonight would be different, that perhaps, surrounded by his daughter and his prestigious guests, he would hold back his tongue. But Donovan Sterling was not a man who held back. He placed his fork down with a soft clink against the china plate, leaned back in his grand chair, and with a cold smile said, "What is this supposed to be?" The chatter around the table died instantly. The guests froze mid-motion, some holding their glasses, others pausing with forks halfway to their mouths. Everyone's eyes shifted toward Donovan and then to Clara, who stiffened as though the words had struck her physically. Donovan lifted a piece of chicken with his fork, holding it up as if displaying a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "Look at this," he continued. "This doesn't look like fine dining. This looks ordinary. Cheap, even. Something you'd find at a roadside diner, not in the home of a Sterling." The words fell heavy in the air. Clara's chest tightened, her lips pressed together. She bowed her head slightly in respect, but inside, shame burned like fire. One of the guests, a tall man in a grey suit, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He glanced at the chicken on his plate, then back at Donovan, as though unsure whether he was allowed to enjoy it now. The others followed his lead, hesitation clouding the room. No one dared contradict Donovan Sterling. He wasn't finished. "You've been here how many years, Clara?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. 10? 12? And yet after all this time, you still haven't learned the difference between ordinary cooking and excellence. Do you think this," he jabbed his fork toward the platter, "is what I expect for my guests? For my daughter?" Clara's throat tightened. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she quickly clasped them together to hide it. Every word cut into her, deeper than a blade. She had risen before the sun that morning, marinating the chicken with garlic and herbs, seasoning the rice with care, baking bread until her kitchen smelled of home. She had put her soul into the dishes, just as she did every day. But to Donovan, none of it mattered. He went on, his voice rising just enough for the sting to be clear. "This household deserves the best. I don't spend billions building an empire just to come home to food that tastes like it belongs in a cafeteria. We are Sterlings. We host leaders, business partners, investors. And you—" His gaze pierced her like a spotlight. "You dare serve this mediocrity?" Clara's vision blurred with unshed tears. She lowered her eyes to the floor, willing herself not to cry. In the Sterling mansion, tears were weakness, and weakness was never forgiven. The guests shifted again, some clearing their throats, others pretending to sip their wine. They weren't uncomfortable because the food was bad. They had tasted enough to know the flavors were rich, warm, and filling. No, their discomfort came from watching Donovan publicly humiliate the woman who had worked faithfully in his home for over a decade. But none of them spoke. None of them dared. Because in that house, Donovan's word was law. The only sound was the faint clatter of Isabel's fork as she gently set it back on her plate. Her face betrayed nothing, but her silence was louder than the murmurs in the room. She glanced at Clara, their eyes meeting for the briefest moment, and in that fleeting connection, Clara saw something she hadn't expected: empathy. But Donovan didn't notice. His attention remained fixed on Clara, as though he needed to crush every ounce of dignity she still held. "Tell me, Clara," he demanded, his voice sharp, "do you think this is good enough for me? For my daughter? For this family?" The room held its breath. Clara's lips parted slightly, but no words came. How could she answer? If she said yes, he'd laugh at her. If she said no, she'd only confirm his disdain. So she stood there, frozen, praying the ground would swallow her whole. Her silence seemed to irritate Donovan further. He leaned forward, his tone dripping with mockery. "Ah, of course you can't answer. Because you know. You know this is beneath us." It wasn't just criticism anymore. It was humiliation. And still, Clara endured. Because what choice did she have? Her job, her survival, even her family's well-being depended on her staying quiet. She had children depending on her paycheck, a roof to keep over their heads. To fight back would mean losing everything. So she bowed her head slightly and whispered, "I'm sorry, sir." The words were barely audible, but Donovan smirked, satisfied. "Sorry doesn't change the taste," he said coldly. The moment hung heavy in the air. The food that minutes earlier had filled the room with warmth now seemed tasteless. The grandeur of the mansion felt suffocating, the glittering chandelier above mocking the pain of the woman who had just been belittled in front of everyone. Clara stepped back against the wall, wishing she could disappear into it. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had never felt so small, so unseen. The laughter that usually filled Sterling dinners was gone, replaced by tension thick enough to choke on. And yet, amidst the silence, a shift began to stir. Subtle, quiet, unnoticed by Donovan. Because while the billionaire basked in his authority, convinced he had asserted his dominance, his daughter sat still, watching. Her silence was not the same as Clara's silence. Clara's was born of fear, but Isabel's was born of choice. A choice that, within minutes, would bring the entire dinner to a standstill. For a few moments after Donovan Sterling's scathing words, the only sounds in the grand dining room were the faint crackle of candles and the distant ticking of the ornate grandfather clock against the wall. Every guest sat rigid, the weight of his cruelty pressing down like an invisible storm. The roasted chicken that moments ago gleamed under the chandelier now seemed untouched, the rich aroma of Clara's cooking swallowed by tension. Clara, standing near the wall, fought to keep her composure. Her throat ached from holding back tears. She had learned to endure humiliation in silence, to bow her head and survive another day. But tonight, surrounded by Donovan's associates and his own daughter, the sting felt sharper, crueler. And then came a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, the faint clink of silver against porcelain. Everyone turned their heads. It was Isabel Sterling. She had picked up her fork and taken a small portion of Clara's seasoned rice. Slowly, Without breaking eye contact with her plate, she raised the fork to her mouth. The tension in the room seemed to pause, like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Donovan, still leaning back in his chair with his glass of wine, raised an eyebrow. "Well, Isabel?" he said, his tone half curious, half commanding. "What do you think of this attempt at dinner?" All eyes were on her now. The daughter of Donovan Sterling, the girl everyone said had inherited her father's sharp wit and her mother's grace. Her opinion, whether she spoke it aloud or not, carried weight. Isabel chewed quietly, her face unreadable. She swallowed, placed the fork gently on the plate, and then nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't nod in approval, nor did she frown in disgust. She simply sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the food as though her silence was the only answer she could give. The silence grew heavy, almost unbearable. Donovan's confident smirk faltered. "What is it, Isabel? Cat got your tongue?" He chuckled, trying to dismiss the moment, but his daughter didn't move. She didn't laugh. She didn't look up. She didn't play into his performance. Instead, she pressed her lips together, her eyes soft but resolute, as though she was carrying a truth too deep for words. The guests began to shift nervously. They weren't used to this. Isabel, the usually lively daughter, known for her laughter and her charm, sitting motionless in a silence that felt like quiet rebellion. One woman at the table adjusted her napkin nervously, glancing at Donovan, then at Isabel, unsure of which way the night was about to turn. Donovan leaned forward now, his tone sharper. "Isabel, I asked you a question. Do you think this is suitable for my table?" But still, she said nothing. Her silence was not empty. It was intentional. It carried weight. It carried meaning. Every second she refused to speak was a blow against her father's arrogance. Clara, standing by the wall, didn't know what to think. Her heart raced. Was Isabel refusing to eat because she agreed with her father, or was her silence something else, something deeper? Clara studied her carefully, noticing the slight tremble in her hands, the way her gaze never once shifted toward Donovan. This was not embarrassment. This was something else entirely. Shame, perhaps, but not for the food. The shame of a daughter listening to her father humiliate a woman who had done nothing but serve him faithfully. Donovan exhaled heavily, his jaw tightening. He was a man used to control, to command. At the boardroom table, his word was law. In his mansion, no one dared cross him. But his own daughter's silence? That was a challenge he didn't know how to face. He tapped his glass against the table, the sharp sound making a few guests flinch. "I asked you something, Isabel. Speak." Still, she remained silent. The silence became louder than any words could have been. It wrapped around the table, seeping into every corner of the room. The guests, once eager to enjoy their meal, now sat stiffly, their appetites gone. Even the butlers at the edges of the room seemed frozen in place, watching a battle unfold without words. Donovan's face darkened. "You're embarrassing me in front of our guests," he snapped. "Answer me." At that, Isabel finally raised her eyes, not to her father, but to Clara. Their gazes locked across the room. Clara's breath caught. In Isabel's eyes she saw something unexpected. Sorrow, compassion, and a quiet strength. Isabel didn't need to speak. Her silence, her refusal to participate in her father's cruelty, said more than words ever could. It was a choice, a statement, a declaration that she would not side with him in this humiliation. The weight of her silence sank into Donovan slowly, like poison spreading through veins. He shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass. For once, the great Donovan Sterling, the man who bulldozed competitors, silenced rivals, and bent the world to his will, was unsettled by the stillness of a teenage girl. And it wasn't just any teenage girl. It was his daughter, his pride, his legacy. The room remained frozen, a battlefield of silence. No one dared speak. No one dared move. The food lay untouched, the grand feast now an afterthought. All that mattered was the quiet defiance of a daughter and the wounded dignity of a maid. Clara's heart, though still heavy with the sting of Donovan's words, felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through it. She didn't dare hope, but for the first time in years, she felt seen, not by Donovan, but by Isabel. By the very girl she had watched grow up. The one she had tucked into bed when her mother passed. The one she had served breakfast to every morning before school. Isabel's silence wasn't rejection. It was protection. It was the only way she could stand up for Clara without sparking her father's fury in an open argument. And in that moment, Clara realized, sometimes the strongest voice in the room isn't the one that shouts. It's the one that refuses to speak. The dinner table, meant to be a place of celebration, now felt like a trial. And in the court of silence, Donovan Sterling's power was losing ground. The dining hall, usually filled with laughter, clinking glasses and confident voices, now felt like a cathedral of silence. The grand chandelier above continued to glow, its crystals scattering fragments of light across the polished table. But no one seemed to notice. The dishes Clara had so carefully prepared sat untouched, steam curling upward and fading into the heavy air, as if even the food itself sensed it was unwelcome. Clara stood against the wall, her hands folded tightly together, her eyes fixed on the floor. Shame burned inside her, though she had done nothing wrong. She had endured Donovan Sterling's cruelty many times before, but never like this. Never in front of guests, never with his daughter watching. What unsettled her most was Isabel's strange reaction. Was she refusing to eat because she agreed with her father? Was her silence an act of disgust for the food Clara had poured her soul into, or was it something else entirely? The question gnawed at Clara. She dared a glance at Isabel. The young girl sat perfectly still, her posture calm, her gaze lowered toward the plate in front of her. Her fork rested neatly beside her, untouched since that single bite of rice. There was no frown, no grimace, no sign of dislike. Instead, there was stillness, a deliberate refusal to participate in the cruelty her father had unleashed. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to believe Isabel's silence was for her, that the girl was silently protesting her father's words, but she couldn't be sure. In a world where servants were often treated as invisible, it was hard to imagine anyone would choose to defend her, even quietly. Donovan, however, noticed the silence. He shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping against the stem of his wineglass. He was not a man accustomed to being ignored. In the boardroom, when he spoke, investors listened. On the construction site, when he gave orders, workers obeyed. Even at home, his word was final, absolute. Yet here, at his own dinner table, his daughter had chosen not to respond. The guests felt the shift too. They exchanged nervous glances, eyes darting between Donovan and Isabel. A woman in a shimmering silver dress took a delicate sip of wine, trying to mask her discomfort. A man in a navy blue suit cleared his throat, as though tempted to change the subject, but thought better of it. No one dared interrupt. The weight of Isabel's silence pressed heavier with each passing second. Finally, Donovan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto his daughter. "Isabel," he said, his tone tight, "I asked you a question." But Isabel remained quiet. Her silence was intentional now, every heartbeat of it louder than thunder. She wasn't ignoring her father out of childish defiance. There was something deeper behind it. Something even Donovan, for all his power, couldn't quite control. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Watching Isabel sit in silence stirred something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe someone in this household saw her, respected her, even if only in a quiet, unspoken way. Donovan's jaw clenched. He drummed his fingers against the table, his patience thinning. "You're making a scene," he muttered. "Our guests are waiting. Say something." Still, Isabel did not move. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his arrogance back at him. For once, Donovan couldn't bend someone's will with words. For once, his authority had no effect. The meaning of her silence began to dawn on those around the table. The silver-dressed woman lowered her gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, as if she understood. The man in the navy blue suit adjusted his cufflinks nervously, realizing the young girl's quiet stand was more powerful than any speech. Donovan, however, refused to see it. His pride wouldn't allow him. He mistook her silence for rebellion, never realizing it was compassion. For Clara, for the woman he had just humiliated. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. She refused to let fall. She remembered Isabel as a child, small and fragile, clinging to Clara's skirt after her mother had passed away. Clara had been the one to sing her lullabies when the house felt too big and empty, the one to braid her hair before school, the one to listen when she needed someone who wouldn't judge her. Perhaps Isabel remembered too. Perhaps this silence was her way of repaying a debt that could never truly be spoken aloud. The minutes dragged on. No one dared touch the food. The feast, meant to be a display of sterling wealth and grandeur, became an exhibit of unspoken truth. Isabel's silence wasn't about the food. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about choosing not to join her father in tearing someone else down. And though she didn't utter a single word, her silence spoke louder than Donovan's thunderous voice ever could. Donovan, restless now, gripped his glass too tightly. His knuckles whitened as he took a long sip of wine, his eyes narrowing at his daughter. He wanted control. He craved it. But he couldn't force her to speak without admitting he had lost it. The guests, sensing his frustration, remained perfectly still. Not one dared break the silence. The clatter of forks and the flow of conversation were gone, replaced by a heavy stillness that felt like judgment itself. Clara finally understood. Isabel wasn't rejecting her food. She was rejecting her father's cruelty. It was the boldest act of defiance a daughter could give, done not with anger, not with disrespect, but with quiet strength. And that realization nearly brought Clara to her knees. For years she had felt invisible in this house. She had worked in the shadows, her efforts overlooked, her sacrifices ignored. But now, for the first time, someone had seen her pain. Someone had chosen, silently, to stand with her. The power shifted in the room. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed fists. But it was there. In the silence that stretched, in the uneaten food, in the unspoken unity between the maid and the daughter of the man who ruled this household. And Donovan Sterling, billionaire and tycoon, sat in his own mansion, facing something he couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, couldn't silence. The quiet truth of his daughter's heart. The silence stretched so long that it felt like time itself had slowed inside the Sterling mansion. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, the clink of glasses and the usual hum of dinner conversation long gone. Clara remained against the wall, her hands pressed together tightly, praying the moment would end before Donovan lashed out again. But then, just as Donovan's patience snapped, Isabel finally lifted her head. Her brown eyes, filled not with fear but with quiet determination, met her father's. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fork on the table like a spoiled child. She simply spoke, her words soft but steady, like a candle flame that refused to go out, even in the storm. "Father," Isabel began, her voice calm yet carrying an unusual weight, "do you know why Clara cooks the way she does?" The room froze. Every head turned toward her, shocked that she had spoken at all, and even more shocked at what she had chosen to say. Donovan arched an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Why she cooks the way she does," he repeated mockingly. "Because she doesn't know any better." But Isabel shook her head gently. "No, Father. She cooks this way because she puts love into her meals." The words hung in the air, delicate yet powerful. "Love?" Donovan scoffed, but his voice had lost a fraction of its authority. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not from his daughter. Isabel continued, her voice gathering strength. "Every dish she makes isn't just food. It's a memory, a story, a tradition passed down from her family. These recipes fed generations before us. They carried people through hardship, through hunger, through struggle. And she brings them here, into this house, to give us more than just meals. She gives us pieces of herself." The guests sat stunned, their eyes darting between Isabel and Donovan. A woman at the far end of the table pressed a napkin to her lips, as though holding back tears. Clara's chest heaved, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Isabel leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You call it ordinary. You call it beneath us. But I call it real. I call it valuable. Because respect isn't about how expensive the plate is or how rare the wine is. Respect is about how we treat the people who serve us, who stand by us, who give to us day after day without asking for anything in return." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with passion. "You've always told me that money buys respect, Father, but that isn't true. Money can buy luxury, attention, even fear. But real respect, real dignity, comes from how we treat others. Tonight, you disrespected the very woman who keeps this home alive." Donovan's smirk faltered. His hand, still gripping his wineglass, tightened until his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His daughter had struck at the very foundation of his pride. The guests exchanged glances, their discomfort shifting into something else. Admiration. None of them would have dared speak up against Donovan, but hearing it from his own daughter made them see the billionaire in a new, unflattering light. Clara stood frozen, her lips parted slightly, unable to believe what she was hearing. For years she had endured harsh words, slights, and dismissal. And now, here was Isabel, defending her, not with anger or arrogance, but with gentle truth. Her knees felt weak, and she gripped the side of the wall to steady herself. Donovan cleared his throat, his voice sharp again. "Isabel, this is hardly the place for such a lecture. You're embarrassing yourself." But Isabel didn't waver. "No, Father," she said softly. "You're embarrassing yourself." The words fell like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the room. A hush descended, deeper than before. Donovan's jaw clenched, his face flushed with both anger and disbelief. Isabel's voice grew quieter now, but every word cut deeper. "Clara isn't just a maid. She's family. She raised me when Mother wasn't here. She tucked me into bed. She listened when I cried. She told me stories when this house felt too big and too cold. And tonight, you humiliated her in front of all of us. Not because her food was bad, it wasn't, but because you've forgotten what truly matters." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming freely now. The room blurred around her, But Isabel's words rang clear as bells. One of the men in suits shifted in his chair and murmured, "She's right." It was faint, but enough to make Donovan's head snap toward him. The man quickly lowered his eyes, but the damage was done. The guests were no longer entirely on Donovan's side. The power at the table had shifted. Donovan leaned back slowly, his chest rising and falling. He had faced boardroom battles, political fights, rivals who wanted nothing more than to see him fall. But this quiet defiance from his daughter, was something he couldn't fight with money, power, or intimidation, because the truth had been spoken and it could not be silenced. The table remained still. The chicken cooled, the rice lost its steam, the bread hardened slightly. But none of it mattered anymore. The meal was no longer the centerpiece of the night. Isabel's words were. Finally, she lowered her gaze, her voice returning to a whisper. "Clara deserves better than your scorn. She deserves respect. And if you can't see that, then maybe you've forgotten what it means to be human." The guests inhaled sharply, as though the words had been said to each of them as well. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. Clara's heart swelled painfully in her chest. She pressed her hands against it, as though trying to contain the flood of gratitude, pride, and relief that threatened to overwhelm her. She had never, in all her years of service, felt more seen than she did in that moment. Donovan Sterling, the man who thought he ruled every room he entered, sat in silence. His empire, his reputation, his control, it all meant nothing in the face of his daughter's gentle defense, and everyone at the table knew it. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence born from awkwardness, nor the kind that comes when a joke falls flat at the table. No, this silence carried weight. It was thick, like the walls of the Sterling mansion themselves had leaned in to listen. Donovan Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hand still gripping the stem of his wineglass. But he did not drink. His usual air of command, the certainty that he was always the most powerful man in the room, had been fractured. His daughter's words still lingered, sharp and clear, echoing in his mind. "You've forgotten what it means to be human." The guests avoided his eyes. Some stared down at their plates, pushing the untouched food around with their forks. Others glanced toward Clara, who stood by the wall, her face streaked with tears, but her back straight as a soldier's. And then there was Isabel, still seated with her head high, her calm gaze never leaving her father. It was as though the world had flipped upside down. For decades, Donovan had built his reputation on control. In business, he crushed competitors with ruthless efficiency. In politics, he swayed votes with charm or intimidation. In his home, his word was law. But tonight, for the first time, his power seemed fragile. Because power means nothing when truth exposes it. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back, ready to remind everyone at the table that he was Donovan Sterling, billionaire, philanthropist, a man whose influence reached beyond city borders. But as his lips parted, something unexpected happened. Nothing came out. His throat tightened. His voice, so often booming, commanding, impossible to ignore, betrayed him. All he could do was sit there, his face reddening, his pride battling against the silence that surrounded him. The silence wasn't mocking him. It wasn't even hostile. It was worse. It was judgment. Every guest at the table was silently asking the same question. What kind of man humiliates a woman who has given so much, only to be corrected by his own daughter? The truth stung like a blade, and Donovan could not fight it. Clara stood trembling, unsure whether to remain or leave. Her instinct told her to retreat, to disappear into the kitchen, to hide from the weight of everyone's eyes. But something stopped her. Isabel's defense had planted courage where there had once been only submission. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and remained rooted in place. For the first time in her years of service, she allowed herself to stand tall in front of Donovan Sterling without shame. The guests began to shift again, not with discomfort this time, but with newfound respect for Clara. A woman who had been invisible, just another servant in the background, was now the quiet center of the room. A man in a dark navy suit coughed softly into his hand, then placed his fork down carefully. "The chicken," he said, his voice breaking the silence for the first time in minutes, "is excellent." The words were small, but they rippled across the table like an unexpected wave. A woman with pearl earrings nodded quickly. "Yes, perfectly seasoned," she added, her voice firmer than before. Another guest murmured agreement, and soon several others chimed in, tentative at first, then with confidence. Donovan's eyes darted from one guest to the next, his authority crumbling further with every word of praise for the very meal he had condemned. His jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. But Isabel smiled faintly. She had not needed to convince the guests with more words. Truth had already taken root. Clara's breath caught. She had never expected anyone, let alone these wealthy, high-society guests, to defend her cooking. Her hands trembled at her sides, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from a rising tide of gratitude that made her chest ache. Donovan slammed his glass down suddenly, the sound sharp against the table. A few guests flinched, but the silence returned almost instantly. He stared at his daughter, his nostrils flaring, his pride screaming at him to reassert control. But Isabel didn't back down. She simply held his gaze, her calm strength radiating through the silence. For the first time, Donovan realized something that shook him to his core. His daughter was not a little girl anymore. She wasn't someone he could silence with a glare or intimidate with authority. She was a woman now, her own woman, and she had chosen to stand with Clara, not him. The silence grew heavier. This time, Donovan wasn't the one in control of it. The silence belonged to Isabel. It belonged to Clara. It belonged to the truth. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. The meal, once meant to showcase wealth and luxury, had transformed into something much greater, a test of character. And Donovan Sterling was failing. He could feel it in the way the guests shifted. He could see it in the way Isabel held herself. And worst of all, he could see it in Clara's eyes. Eyes that no longer looked at him with quiet submission, but with a strength he hadn't noticed before. Donovan had been stripped of his armor. All that remained was silence, and in that silence, everyone at the table could see who he truly was. Isabel broke it gently. "Eat," she said softly, her eyes still locked on her father. "Enjoy the meal Clara has prepared for us. That's all that matters tonight." Her voice carried no anger, only quiet dignity. And just like that, the tension loosened. The guests began to eat, their movements cautious at first, then more natural. Laughter did not return, nor did lively conversation. But the silence that remained wasn't empty anymore. It was thoughtful. Every bite of food carried weight, not just flavors, but meaning. Clara slipped back into the kitchen, not because she felt dismissed, but because she needed a moment to breathe. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she leaned against the counter. Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of long-suppressed pride finally breaking free. In the dining room, Donovan remained rigid, his utensils untouched. He had lost the battle, though he refused to admit it aloud. Isabel's words and the silence that followed had done what no rival, no enemy, no critic had ever achieved. They had humbled him. He glanced at his daughter again, but she didn't look away. And in that moment, Donovan realized something even more painful than humiliation. He was proud of her. Proud and threatened all at once. The dinner that was supposed to showcase his dominance, his wealth, and his refined taste had ended in silence, a silence that told the truth louder than words ever could. Because silence, when born from truth, has more power than the loudest voice in the room. And on that night, Donovan Sterling, billionaire and master of control, sat in silence while his daughter and the maid he had scorned held all the power.